This is John Echeverria again, and welcome to the CERCLA panel, saving the very best for last. This is the top banana, the premier act, the ne plus ultra of federal. I've turned the live feed off, which was I was going to rely on that to get the questions, but hopefully this will work. Okay. So I will introduce our three panelists. We'll go 16, 17 minutes. That will hopefully leave some time for questions. And the program contains detailed materials on each of the speakers. I'm not going to repeat that. But very briefly, we will launch with Katie Kaiman, who is a supervising attorney with the Tennessee Justice Center. We will then hear from Shawn Collins from Illinois, an experienced environmental litigator. And then we will wrap up with Anna Baptista, who is as an assistant professor of professional practice at the Milano School of Policy Management and the Environment at the New School, where she also serves as the associate director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center. Well, without further ado, and hopefully no further technical complications, Katie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to try to share my presentation, so just give me one moment. All right. Hopefully folks can see that.
Yes, looks good.
Yes. Okay, great. So thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Katie Kaiman, and I am an attorney, and I'm going to be speaking about a case study that I've worked on. It is known as Old Smokey, and I'm going to be discussing environmental injustice and my proposal for community-based reparations in lieu of environmental lawsuits, and also, of course, discussing CERCLA to a certain extent. I'm currently the supervising attorney and pro bono coordinator for the Tennessee Justice Center, and I'm really delighted to be with you all today. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this panel. So I currently work at the Tennessee Justice Center doing mostly healthcare litigation on behalf of individuals needing assistance with their Medicaid benefits or other public benefit programs. But my previous experience and my passion and dedication really lies with environmental justice, and obviously environmental injustice is what we mostly work on and see. And so my experience as the co-founder and supervising attorney and lecturer for the University of Miami School of Law Environmental Justice Clinic, it's a mouthful, is what really started me on this path. After I worked at the Environmental Justice Clinic, I moved and worked with Earth Justice, and specifically I worked with the community of Uniontown, Alabama, that I will not be discussing that much today, but is important for our overall conversation when it comes to CERCLA. And so I will give a brief overview about Uniontown. For those of you who are unfamiliar, it is a very small, predominantly African-American community in the Black Belt region of Alabama. It received a lot of national press and media because of the coal ash landfill that was opened there in 2008, 2010, and so forth. And it took about 400 million tons of coal ash from the Kingston TVA spill that occurred in Tennessee, where I am now. And what's interesting and relevant to this conversation about Uniontown is that this happened in the last, decade or so. And so CERCLA was actually a very large part of the citing and of the decision-making by the EPA and by state regulators in Alabama to allow for this massive amount of coal ash to be shipped in to this very small community that has folks that live adjacent to this landfill. I represented individuals who live adjacent to this landfill. They experience a tremendous amount of nuisance on their property, of potential health concerns while the coal ash was being trucked in, as well as while the coal ash was actually being put into the landfill itself. And so what's important to note about Uniontown is that it is something that is most folks would consider an environmental injustice that occurred very much under the paradigm of CERCLA and was essentially blessed by the EPA. So just a little fun, not so fun fact we've got there. But I do want to talk today about Old Smokey. And Old Smokey is known as, it's known as Old Smokey, but it was essentially a city of Miami trash incinerator. It was located in the Coconut Grove neighborhood of the city of Miami. The founding location of the city of Miami is actually Coconut Grove. It was founded by Black Bahamians in the late 1800s. It was very well known for being a place where white and Black folks actually lived relatively harmoniously from that late 1800s period until about the 1920s. And that's, of course, when Jim Crow essentially made its way down to South Florida, something that folks don't often think about, but it made its way. And at that point in time, the city of Miami and the city of Coral Gables were segregated by law. So the segregated community of Coral Gables, which is home to the University of Miami, was known as the Black Gables, and the segregated community of Coconut Grove was known as the West Grove. And these two communities are actually situated adjacent to one another and somewhat straddled by a highway known as US 1. To this day, these communities are still largely segregated by race. The only reason that they are actually becoming more integrated is because these communities are being massively gentrified and redeveloped, which is resulting in the displacement of generations of Black Bahamians. So Old Smokey. It's a trash incinerator, like I mentioned, that was located in the heart of a segregated community. It was adjacent to a segregated elementary and middle school, adjacent to numerous churches, to public housing, to private homes, and to the oldest historic Black preschool in South Florida. These entities largely still exist the way that they did in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. They are still very much the same today. The trash incinerator operated very poorly for nearly 50 years. It was forced to close finally because of a series of nuisance lawsuits that began in the 1960s, and it was eventually ordered to be closed by the courts in the 1970s. The smokestack still stood until it was demolished several years later. There are actually photographs of the demolition in which elementary school children were brought outside to watch the demolition. Obviously without any sort of protective covering or anything like that. So it just shows, to a certain extent, how far we may have come in understanding what environmental contamination actually looks like. And part of those lawsuits that were brought, they were actually brought by wealthy, affluent white residents who lived in Coral Gables, who essentially their claim was that it was operating as a nuisance because there was ash in their pool. That is obviously pales in comparison to what the community that was, most closely adjacent to the incinerator suffered with. And if there was ash in a pool, then there was certainly ash on clotheslines, ash on properties, in homes, that sort of thing. So the siting, the operation, and the inevitable downfall of Old Smokey occurred almost entirely prior to the major environmental laws that were passed in the US. So CERCLA, as we know, wasn't even passed until 1980, which is well after the incinerator had ceased operations. After the smokestack was demolished, the former site in the same building was renovated to serve as a City of Miami fire training college. As far as we know, no remediation occurred on site or off site at any of the schools, homes, or churches. Not until 2013, when a whistleblower actually came to me and my colleagues at the university, did anyone know that there was even the potential for legacy contamination. No one had been thinking about it. It wasn't on anyone's radar. It was soon revealed to us through leaked documents and public records requests that not only was the site itself loaded with heavy metals in the soil, but so were adjacent properties. So during this time, while we were working to uncover the true extent of contamination in the West Grove, it was revealed that a City of Miami park in the more affluent, whiter side of Coconut Grove was contaminated with incinerator ash. So much so that during renovations on the park, these were renovations that were being done, separate and apart from what was happening with Old Smokey, There were old soda bottles and other relics from the time of the incinerator's operation that had not been properly burned. And this was one of the ways that we all determined that it was actually ash from the incinerator that had been dumped into this children's and dog parks, which is known as Blanche Park. From here, the public outcry now became quite deafening. As you might imagine, when we were working on this in regards to the Fire Training College and in regards to the schools and properties that were still in that West Grove community, it was very difficult to get elected officials to pay any attention to claims of contamination. Soon, though, it became clear that other City of Miami parks that had been created after the 1950s were also filled with the same toxic incinerator ash. And eventually, it was revealed that at least 8 City of Miami parks had been used as dump sites for the incinerator. So essentially, right, when an incinerator is operating, it doesn't burn up everything. And this incinerator operated incredibly poorly for its entire existence. And so you would have tons of ash that was sometimes not even ash. It was still, right, had those pieces, had those bottles, things in it. And so that was carted off to quarries, and these quarries eventually became City of Miami parks without any sort of remediation or any sort of thought process really behind what it meant to have ash underneath these parks. So what does this do for the West Grove? It certainly brought a lot of media attention. This is from a 2013 New York Times article. And so we did get some big press right away. But still, it didn't fix everything, and it certainly hasn't fixed it all now. And so one of the very first things that came up was, can we bring a lawsuit? Asked the community, right? Whether we could bring a lawsuit for historic and continuing contamination. Almost all of the parks that were contaminated were in wealthy, whiter neighborhoods. These residents worked very quickly, and they hired their own attorneys to figure out what they could do. I think it was a true testament to how poor environmental laws are in these scenarios that not even these folks ended up bringing lawsuits. They really just used their power and influence to ensure very, very fast and very top of the line remediation in their neighborhood parks. One example would be that the Merry Christmas Park I think it had more than 2 feet of soil removed from the park, and then, replaced with clean soil. And one of the parks that was in the West Grove neighborhood actually only had 8 inches of topsoil removed. And so that's just an example of the disparity in the remediation of these parks. Just a fun fact that one of the residents who lived near these parks became so inspired to be involved in politics that he actually ran for City of Miami Commission and won, and is still on that commission. So as for the West Grove, it took about 4 years in 2017 for a lawsuit to finally be brought. It's a class action lawsuit on behalf of residents and homeowners who were exposed to toxic ash and smoke for decades, and who also believe that they have health issues that were caused by this. There are also claims for property damage, trespass, nuisance, and medical monitoring. Medical monitoring is is a remedy in several states that allows for the potential to essentially be monitored, right? So to have either regular physician appointments, specific type of blood work, specific type of scans for the type of exposure, of environmental exposure that your body has incurred, so that if you were to develop some sort of issue, medical issue from that exposure, you would be able to catch it early on. It also requires, obviously, the defendant to pay for that medical monitoring scheme. So this case was filed, like I said, in 2017, and more than 4 years later, it is actually still ongoing, and there has still not been justice for the West Grove community. So this led me to think differently about our environmental justice laws, about civil rights laws, and about what sort of remedies are actually available to these communities. And so I, like many lawyers and many folks in academia, I wrote a law review article about it. And it is about community-based reparations and environmental justice. So my experience working with this community certainly led me to understand that there are woefully inadequate legal remedies available for this type of harm. Old Smokey is only one example. It is only one example of many thousands that are across this country. And as we know, communities that are Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor are most at risk for environmental injustices. And these injustices can be anything from trash incinerators like Old Smokey to landfills, manufacturing plants, the whole gamut. After speaking with so many community members, the refrain I heard the most was that they wanted the city of Miami and the county, because in this case, they were the regulatory agency, to account for what they had done. In addition to apologies, the community wanted access to healthcare and other preventative measures to make sure that they had the best medical care and specific medical care for what they had been exposed to for decades, most of the time for their entire lifetimes. The law was largely inadequate for this purpose. And as is clear from the timeline that I've just mentioned, it's been nearly 10 years since all of this came to light, and the community is still suffering from this injustice. Some cleanup has been done, but not much. Individuals who faced exposure have not received appropriate medical care, and so much more. The other thing that I heard over and over from community members was the desire to have funding to help the neighborhood. Communities that suffer environmental injustices also suffer other injustices that often make their communities devalued, such as housing injustice, transportation, lack of transportation access, lack of access to schools, right? The whole thing that we think of when we think of America and systemic racism. West Grove residents wanted to fix this, and they wanted community centers, scholarship programs, and museums, and other unique ideas that were specific to their residents and their community. My proposed framework for environmental injustice reparations absolutely must include the recognition of and responsibility for environmental injustices, the acknowledgement of the affected community, respect and incorporation of the affected community in the discussion, and that is super important, and reparations in the form of a community-based or individual funds. So when we think of reparations, right, I think largely the conversation has been changing as we're actually thinking about it from a more feasible and actual possibility sense. And so reparations don't have to be, right, these individual checks. And in the case of the West Grove, largely folks wanted something that was for the community, something that was truly community-based. The proposed framework also came out of meetings with Old Smokey Steering Committee individuals we had organized prior to. So I'll just wrap up real quickly, that the city recognized that the community wanted the city to recognize that the grave environmental injustice that they had suffered, and they wanted to be acknowledged as the residents who had actually lived there, as the children who had attended school there, and as the firefighters who had been working in that old incinerator building. And they also wanted to include the community in its negotiations and discussions. And they wanted a reparations program. Things that had been discussed were right to know laws, further testing and remediation, and the creation of a Bahamian American History Museum in the West Grove that would discuss the injustices perpetrated against the community. These reparations programs would be coming from local, state, or federal government, depending on which entities had the power to decide siting, permitting, operations, etc. As you can see, lawsuits are costly, and often they are unavailable for these communities that don't have access to attorneys and to other, evidence that needs to be gathered in order to win in court. They take years, sometimes decades, and we've certainly made advancements in jurisprudence surrounding environmental justice, but we still have a very long way to go. Thank you so much.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Shawn. You are now on.
All right. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. Appreciate the chance to talk to you. So again, my name is Shawn Collins. I run a 12-lawyer private law firm outside Chicago. In a nutshell, what we do is we sue polluters. Two kinds of cases. One is where a community's air or water supply is contaminated. Those usually called property damage cases in our courts. The other kind of lawsuit is the saddest kind, and that is where exposure to the pollution has made someone ill, maybe killed them. And we do those kinds of cases as well. being with those kinds of people who've lost their health, being with the family of someone who's lost their life, because of this really sharpens the point. It's really sharpened the point for me about what is at stake in all of this stuff we're talking about here. One of the reasons I know what a great law school Vermont is that one of your graduates, Maggie Galka, works with me at our firm. She's a 2018 graduate of your law school, and she is, in the very best sense of the term, an absolute environmental warrior. And every battle we've been in since she's joined us, she is right there with me and the other lawyers at the firm. Very, very proud to have her. We do our cases all over the country. Most are in the Midwest. There's just so much pollution in the Midwest that there's a never-ending supply of work, sadly, for what we do. We are one of the things I wanted to mention about the kind of work we do is in every case, we are up against one of the biggest, best funded law firms in the country, top flight law schools, great legal talent, best arguments, respected in the courts. That's always the advantage the other side has, that the polluter has against us. One of the great things about it is it makes it especially fun when we beat the hell out of him in court, which is generally how our cases have gone. What I want to talk to you about is what I've learned from my experience. I've been doing this for 21 years. I've handled, I think it's 18 now, cases of the kind I've told you about. And I have analyzed hundreds of others. Before we take a case, we generally do months of due diligence, sometimes 6 months or more. And so we've had the chance to analyze many hundreds of cases beyond those we've actually done. And I feel I've got a very good sense of what's going on environmentally in this country and the intersection of what's going on environmentally with what's going on in many other aspects of our community. And I wholeheartedly agree with Katie. I agree with everything she said, but I thought one of the most important things for all of you to understand about what she said is how much it is true that the people who get screwed in the environment, the people who have to contend with pollution, the people who have to see their kids exposed to horrible industrial pollutants are the very same people who are mistreated in many other aspects of our society as well. I'm going to talk some more about that in a little bit. What I also see, very sadly, the real bad news that's come to me in the couple of decades I've been working in this field is to see how much our government at the state and local level has gotten out of the business of serious environmental enforcement. We've got some very good laws on the books, certainly at the federal level. And in Illinois, where I am, we've got some pretty good laws here too. Other states have good ones, but if they're not enforced, they're not worth a damn. And I've really seen a very steady erosion in the willingness and the funding to enforce environmental laws. And that's very sad. What it has done, it has created opportunity for me and my firm. We try to step up, fill in the breach. We try to bring the kind of lawsuits that our government really should be bringing and try to find justice for communities and individuals badly impacted by the contamination. But there's just no substitute for an aggressive and well-funded government agency full of talented, well-meaning lawyers and what they can do to make things better in this country. Sadly, it's not what's going on right now, not in my experience. There are some exceptions, of course, but as a general rule, we are going absolutely in the wrong direction. When I think about CERCLA, I think of it this way, also unfortunate, but it's an inescapable conclusion. And I call CERCLA America's empty promise. Really America's phony promise, to be very, very blunt about it. It started out in the early 1980s just so wonderfully. It was such a beautiful expression of an important American value. It basically said to our citizens, your life and health are valuable, your child's life and health are valuable. No one should have to live in a community where these important things are threatened. And it was really a very broad admission of responsibility. It was our government essentially saying to our people that we know we've allowed some bad things to happen. We've allowed a lot of polluting, a lot of dumping of some very dangerous chemicals, and now we're going to do something about it. a wonderful start. It's not perfect, but just a really beautiful beginning expression of commitment to something very important. It was, as you probably know, it was funded through taxes on some of the biggest polluters in the world, petroleum and chemical companies. So, you know, off to a good start. But what has happened since is what makes this promise phony, in my judgment. Beginning in 1995, you may know that Congress did not reauthorize the tax on the petroleum and chemical polluters. So in very large measure, CERCLA has been defunded, not completely, but really to the tune of about 75%. I mean, the money just isn't there. So what good is the promise? That's why I call it a phony promise. Well, we're going to protect you. We're going to clean up these horribly contaminated sites. That's how the law reads. That's how the regulations read, but the money isn't there, right? And even as the number of dangerously polluted sites is increasing, the funding has gone down. It's about 25% of what it used to be. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody with their eyes open in America that disproportionately it's communities of color in the United States that are paying the price for this, for what's happened to CERCLA and what's happened generally to our lack of commitment to a healthy environment. A couple of statistics for you. 50% of those who live within 3 miles of Superfund sites are persons of color. 70% of Superfund sites within a mile are within a mile, located within a mile of government-assisted housing, and the majority of whose residents are persons of color. Studies tell us that the most accurate predictor, and listen to how sad this is, the most accurate predictor of where hazardous waste facilities will be located is race. That's the most accurate predictor. And so CERCLA is indeed an expression of our values. 40 years ago, it was essentially, we've got your back. 40 years later, in 2021, it's also an expression of our value, except our value now is you're on your own. With regard to the safety of your community, the air you breathe, the water you drink, you are on your own. The defunding of CERCLA and the abandonment of communities of color, also sad to report, it's not isolated. None of this is happening in a vacuum. There are many other recent developments in the last 5 years and even more recent than that tell us that not only are communities of color on their own, but it's actually worse than that. Our government, in many respects, our environmental protection agencies and our health agencies aren't really working for the people in many instances. They've really been co-opted by the polluters. We've seen many examples of that, most prominently and recently, the Trump administration, but that's far from the only one. So the government really isn't out there fulfilling its mission to protect our people, including and especially communities of color, most impacted by this horrible pollution we have throughout this country. But they've really been co-opted by the polluters. So here's what's going on. Here's what I see. I talked about it a moment ago. Our government is defunding environmental enforcement budgets, federal level, state level, mostly Republicans, but Democrats too. And it breaks my heart as a lifelong Democrat to see that and to say that, but that is the truth of it. They're not doing their jobs either. In fact, raiding environmental cleanup funds is pretty easy money for politicians looking to cut taxes, to cut government spending, to give the money to other interests that they wish to serve. So the defunding of environmental enforcement budgets is going on all over the place. Another thing we see in a case Maggie and I are working on now is polluter-funded science. Here's what happened, just in a nutshell, and you could do a whole law school course on this, but what happens is when these polluters get in trouble, let's say a law firm like Maggie's and mine, we get them into court and we get them in front of a jury, and the issue is, has their chemical done injury to people? Has it harmed someone's health? Has it killed somebody? What they have done in preparation for that lawsuit is they have hired and paid a lot of money to so-called scientists to prepare studies that define downward the dangers of the chemical that it is at issue in the case. And so the environmental evidence, the epidemiological evidence, which is front and center in the case, or at least the polluters put it there, is so-called science that they have funded, that they have paid for with hand-picked scientists. And that's what competes with government-funded studies. And it's going on all over the place, and I can tell you it is working. There's a lobbying organization in our country called the American Chemistry Council. You may have heard of it. What they do is they work for polluters, and they work to try to convince government that chemicals aren't as dangerous as these chemicals really are. They have 54 full-time paid lobbyists who are at work every day all over this country to try to persuade government to define downward the dangers of chemicals. What we're also seeing, and we're in the very early stages of this, something going on in the country, very, very dangerous. It's sometimes euphemistically called the Texas two-step, and it too is worthy of its own course, but here it is in a nutshell. Some big company, most recently Johnson & Johnson, they get found to have polluted our environment, to have sickened people and even killed people. Johnson & Johnson's case, their talcum powder was found to have, in many cases already, to have caused ovarian cancer in women and killed some of them. All of these liabilities mount up, and what these companies now are trying to do, it's called the Texas two-step, as I said, is to create a separate company that will warehouse all of the liabilities, and then they bankrupt the company. And so there's very little or nothing left for the injured victims, having taken these companies to court and beaten them with evidence and gotten a jury verdict in their favor, sometimes in the billions. These companies now work, and polluters will be working. They'll be following this template to make sure there's no money available to people. This is all happening in their country. In our country, we have some states, Michigan is one, where the statute of limitations there, or at least it was when I looked a year and a half ago, this is the statute of limitations, the time period that people have to sue. It says 3 years, but the Supreme Court of the state of Michigan has declared that the 3 years starts when the contaminant first gets to your property, not when you first know about it. And the upshot of that is people in the state of Michigan lose their claim for environmental contamination and exposure. They lose that claim sometimes decades before they even knew they had it. This is the law of some states in the United States of America. Now, again, all of this lands disgustingly, but truthfully, most heavily on communities of color. And it shouldn't be any surprise to an American that the same communities that have lousy access to jobs and schools and healthcare, whose children are mistreated and sometimes killed by the police, who some politicians work actively to strip them of their right to vote because they've exercised their right to vote in a way that politicians didn't like, that it's these same communities who are consigned to live and to raise their children in some of the most dangerous communities in the country that in very significant measure as a country we are abandoning. So we've got the perfect right, and we should be disgusted by this, but none of us should be surprised. We've seen this coming. One of the saddest things for me is when I go to a community of color and I'm considering taking their case, and usually it's an environmental problem that's been there for a while, and I talk to them about, well, why didn't you call a lawyer like me sooner? And oftentimes the children are ill, and it's just horrible. And what I hear is this heartbreaking resignation. At bottom, what these citizens tell me is, in not so many words, but this is the basic message: I had no faith that my government would do anything. I had no faith that anybody cared enough to help me. And so it's not that communities of color don't know there's a problem. It's not that they don't know that they're being mistreated. It's that they don't believe that the things that government can and should do to protect them, government will do to protect them. And they are right. So, and they look at things like a statute of limitations that strips them of their right to file a lawsuit before they even know they have one as a trick. The kind of trick that's been pulled on them for the entire history of this country and before. So we are in a bad way here, and I'm sorry that the message is so sad and so negative, but there's no point in starting out your legal career with anything other but the truth, in my judgment. So let me say very quickly, I'm sure I'm over my time, and I apologize, but let me offer.
I do want to save time for Anna.
All right. So a couple things very quickly, John, and I'm sorry, and Anna, I'm sorry, and thank you. What can you do? What can you do? We use, Maggie and our firm, we use the tort system. We go after these polluters. We drag them in front of juries where they're threatened with such a large judgment that we create leverage against which we can use to get clean water supplies for people, to get the polluter to behave, to do medical monitoring, for example. That's one. Support community right to know laws, vitally important. Get deeply involved in politics. There's no question that politics intersects very heavily with this. And if we don't have good people in office and sitting on benches, there's no hope for any of this. Finally, I'll say this to all of you folks who will soon have law degrees: don't go work for these bastards. You're about to get this great gift. Those of you who will graduate, you're going to have this great and powerful gift of a law degree. Use it to work for what is good and just in our society, and to work against these forces that, at least in the environmental arena and many others besides, are pushing our country in the wrong direction, in my judgment. John, again, I'm sorry. Anna, I'm sorry, but that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much. Anna, you have your full time, so proceed.
No, thank you. And that was very well said, Shawn. I really appreciate your advice to young lawyers, having gone up against many corporate lawyers. In the case I'm going to share with you, so I'm going to try to share my screen now. Let me just see if I can get this to work here. Go into present mode. I don't know if you can see. Can you see the presentation, or can you see it?
I cannot. I'm sorry. I cannot.
Okay. There's a slight delay.
Okay. A minute. See if it works. I'll try it again. See if that works.
But are you using Google Chrome? The question is asked. You have to launch something, and then maybe some other trick.
Yeah. Well, it always works well in practice, but then not so much in the real thing. But I'll try it one more time. See if that works.
There it is.
How about that?
We see it.
There we go.
See it.
There we go.
All right. So let me just. Oh, sorry about that. I'm going to hit present then. All right. Apologize for the technical delay there, but I'm not a lawyer, but I have been working on a Superfund called the Passaic River Superfund in the city of Newark for a very long time now, for almost 2 decades now, as an activist. Really, I am a professor now at the New School University, but really began my advocacy and activism and environmental justice movement having grown up in the city of Newark. I actually lived just a few blocks from the Passaic River most of my life, and went on to get my PhD and came back home to Newark and worked for an environmental justice advocacy organization called the Ironbound Community Corporation, located in the city of Newark. And the Ironbound Community Corps was really a long-standing advocacy group in the neighborhood that dealt with a lot of industrial pollution and the legacy of industry in the city that is largely people of color, African American, Latino, as well as a very diverse range of immigrants that still live and reside in the city today. So it's very much a classic environmental justice community, and as such has a really long legacy of not only industrial pollution, but now also, of course, many Superfund sites, and one of them being the Passaic River. And so I'm going to talk a little bit in depth about the Passaic River because I've spent quite a bit of time, as I said, almost 20 years now on the community advisory group for this particular Superfund site. Just to give you a little bit of background, I mean, the city of Newark itself is home to many to I think 4 or 5. We just got another Superfund site listed, so we have about 5 Superfund sites still on the NPL, but we have hundreds of brownfield sites and former industrial sites that look like this, right next door to recreation fields, schools, homes. Many people's homes are actually built on former industrial sites that are brownfields with deed restrictions. So the whole community is really laden with these types of facilities. The Passaic River is in my mind, a really special case of, maybe not special is not the right word, but a very interesting case because it represents not just an environmental injustice like we think about, living next to a hazardous waste site, because it's a river ecosystem and the kind of contamination that's in the river and on the land. It really is an intergenerational fight. It has really become this legacy that continues to impact communities and ecosystems all along the 17-mile stretch of the river, and will probably continue to do so for many decades, even after it has been remediated. So the contamination of the Passaic River, it was listed in 1984. Both the physical site of Diamond Shamrock, which is the former home of the production of Agent Orange. It was one of the largest manufacturing plants of the herbicide Agent Orange used in the Vietnam War. And that plant continued to actually manufacture herbicides and pesticides well into the 1970s. And there was obviously dumping that occurred directly into the Passaic River that contaminated all 17 miles with Agent Orange, with dioxin contaminants, in addition to many other contaminants like PCBs, mercury, and the like. So it was one of the world's largest dioxin contaminated sites. And it runs across the entire 17-mile of this ecosystem into the Newark Bay. And the Superfund listing that happened in 1984 applied to the upland facility where the plant was formerly, as well as sort of the immediate area in front of it, and went on to be expanded beyond the lower 8.3 miles to the whole 17 miles. And the river, when it was listed in 1984, the community residents, there's a large public housing complex right next door to the plant. Many workers lived just blocks within the plant and had worked there and had been sick for a long time. And when it was listed in 84, the governor declared the whole zone a disaster zone, which was ironic to the residents who lived there, who had been living with the abandoned site for almost a decade. And the EPA sent out, men in moon suits to vacuum the streets in front of their homes as they sat there and watched them. So they had been living with dioxin-laced soil and water for a very long time, either working in the plant or living near it. And the disaster designation really rang hollow to them because they had been seeing their families getting sick from very rare cancers, particularly reproductive issues in the community. And there was a lot of organizing that happened in the 1980s. Men who had come back from the Vietnam War impacted by Agent Orange came together with many of the workers at the plant, as well as local residents, to demand a more swift action on the cleanup. And that, so there was a lot of organizing that happened across many people impacted by dioxin. In that interim period from 1984 to, essentially, 2015, 2016, it took over 30 years of community organizing and pressure to try to get the responsible parties to the table and develop a record of decision, to get a record of decision out of the US EPA. And it was daunting, to be honest. Sitting on the community advisory group, many of the residents were frustrated by the lack of action from the state and federal trustees. And it was really a product of very heavy lobbying by these corporations to drag their feet on the remedial investigation, to do everything possible, including lobbying in Congress, to try to water down alternatives and basically bribe officials up and down the river to try to, oppose a very extensive cleanup. So it was with a lot of struggle that we got to a record of decision on the lower 8 miles. Senator Cory Booker at the time that the record of decision was finally released, called the Passaic River one of the New Jersey's biggest crime scenes. And that really, rang true for residents who had been living for generations with this very contaminated site in their backyard. And the record of decision is quite large. It will, when completed in the lower 8 miles stretch, will be $1.4 billion cleanup. It will require the dredging bank to bank of the lower 8 miles. And at the same time, actually just last week, the EPA announced an interim cleanup plan for the upper 9 miles of the river that will not be as extensive, but will try to align with what will be a 10-year cleanup process on this river. So we are still in the design phase. We anticipate that the dredging will begin until probably 2023. And just another note I'll mention is that in addition to New Jersey being home to many, the largest density of Superfund sites in the country, we have that distinction. We also have the distinction of being among the most at risk from coastal flooding of our Superfund sites. And during Hurricane Sandy, the Passaic River breached its banks, and 9 feet of water came from the Passaic River into people's homes, and all manner of contamination entered their homes. And people were not prepared for that and are still not prepared for that. So we are still at an extreme risk. The Union of Concerned Scientists developed this report, this fact sheet on the risk of flooding, of coastal flooding and Superfund sites. And you'll see New Jersey is right in the heart of the risk area. And, the residents have been, again, organizing to try to demand that in the interim, while we wait for cleanups to occur, a decade-long cleanup to occur, that there are protections put in place for residents who are subject to this flooding, this frequent flooding, and that will become more intense as climate change increases. And you'll see that the University of Concerned Scientists did some really interesting modeling of both current and future potential NPL sites that are at risk from flooding and climate risk. And I'll just, mention a few things. I know Shawn mentioned, some of the disappointments in CERCLA. The Passaic River, the cleanup that we've been able to fight for in the city of Newark for the Passaic River has really been the blood, sweat, and tears of many, many residents organizing, pressuring politicians, fighting back, very powerful people who spend millions of dollars lobbying and on PR, and also on trying to water down remedies that could clean up this river. And, we saw all sorts of things, tactics used. I've learned quite a bit about the tactics that, responsible parties will use when you're talking about a $1.4 billion price tag. Things like, not only developing alternative science to suggest much less extensive cleanup processes, funding universities to do bench projects and pilot projects to delay final decisions on alternatives. We actually saw a really novel use of things like a fish swap program. So instead of saying that, consuming fish from the river will be risky, proposing that people who are fishing from the river for subsistence swap out their fish for a tilapia given to them on the banks of the river. I mean, crazy stuff that you couldn't possibly make up. So, as a community, we have to be, had to be extremely vigilant, and the community advisory group through the Superfund law allowed us a way to organize residents along this river and to push back on a lot of that very organized lobbying very interesting alternatives that the polluters were driving. And I have to say, not only have we seen now, the record of decision, but we are also fighting for things like the Superfund Jobs Training Initiative and funding for that in this next, hopefully what will come out of a funding package in Congress that allows local residents who've been impacted to be potentially trained and hired on the job site. If we're talking about a decade-long, billion-dollar cleanup, our residents should see some of the benefits of that through job production. So Super JTI is very important to us on the Superfund cleanup. And we've already started negotiations about the natural resource damages, which is always a fight as well, because we have communities and federal trustees who would, prefer not to see any cleanup happen until the river is completely cleaned up. But the community has successfully developed over a 20-mile stretch of waterfront park in the time it's taken us to get a cleanup. And so you'll see a picture here of our waterfront park, and people, when I started doing this work as a young person just out of grad school, when we said, the community was like, we want a park on this river, and people thought we were nuts. They're like, this is the dirtiest river in America. You can't put a park next to it. It should just be industry. But the residents said, no, we deserve this access to this river. There's generations of people who did not have access to the river, didn't even know it existed, or those who did were terrified of it. And I'm very proud to say that community organizing has allowed for the opening up of a connection of people, people of color, people who were basically denied the right of this resource for generations to finally return to the riverbanks. So we're hoping that in the next decades ahead, we'll actually be able to return to the water itself. So that's it. I'm going to end there so we can turn to questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Anna. And thank you to all the panelists. That was wonderful. I am trying to get access to the chat. And so Mr. Collins, so the question for you, I'm just starting with the first one that pops up, is what is the best way to combat dark money influence from these polluting groups? With hurdles like the decision in Citizens United, it makes me wonder what can be done to fight it.
Okay, so I think you have to adopt a long-term strategy, and you have to find a way in the process that you're comfortable with, right? I think that decision is going to be with us for a long time, especially given the makeup of the Supreme Court that we have right now. Right. One of the ways I think an environmental lawyer, environmental professional of many stripes can have a real impact here is to use the courts. What I found is that while many aspects of our government is failing us, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes resorting to the courts. I found at the federal level is especially receptive to this kind of a message. And when these polluters are like vampires, right? They don't like the sunlight. You want to drag them out into the sunlight as often as you can in court, in other kind of media presentations, demanding public right to know laws, demanding that government tell citizens what it knows about how dangerous the air is to breathe and the water is to drink in their community. And as an environmental lawyer, other environmental professional in those kinds of circumstances, if you are authentically dedicated to making things better for people, you can. And I think that's the best way to fight. You're fighting at that point the consequences of what Citizens United has allowed these polluters and other huge corporate interests to buy. You're fighting the manifestation of it, but you can be very effective in that kind of environment, I've found.
Anna, who spells her name with one N, like my sister. We have a couple of other questions about environmental justice. I think could be directed to you, and I'll just wrap them up by saying, what is the single thing the Biden administration could do now to advance the cause of environmental justice?
Well, I wish there was one single thing he could do. Yeah, right now, I think a lot of the environmental justice organizations around the country are very focused on investments, key investments in environmental justice communities, and there are very specific asks that are being driven through multiple avenues in the Build Back Better negotiations and even in the reconciliation package. So in terms of investments, there's a lot that the EJ communities are asking for to really, as a form of almost like reparations, really, these are the communities that have been forgotten in a myriad of ways and left behind. And so those types of investments are going to be critical. He made a commitment to this Justice 40, which is, dedicating 40% of investment benefits of existing programs and future programs to EJ or what he calls disadvantaged communities. But beyond that, I think many in the environmental justice community would like to see codification of, an approach to cumulative impacts that has been woefully missing from environmental decision making, whether it's in permitting, whether it's in enforcement, or even in investments. There has not been a targeted approach to try to address cumulative impacts. And I'm very proud to say New Jersey passed a cumulative impacts law recently that, the EJ groups that, along with myself, have been pushed and they're getting through rulemaking now. But we need that at the federal level. We really need a cumulative impacts regulatory approach. And EJ communities who have these legacies of pollution cannot begin to repair that harm unless we can first stop adding to the harm and then starting to ratchet down that legacy pollution across multiple mechanisms. So yeah, I'd say cumulative impacts for sure.
Okay, that's very helpful.
If I may, I was just
Please.
I wanted to just add something. I totally agree with everything that Anna was just saying. But certainly the Biden administration could actually take seriously OCR complaints that have been made to the EPA. I don't remember the statistic off the top of my head, but the EPA's Office of Civil Rights administrative complaints under Title VI that have been made are the most that go unanswered for decades. And sometimes they're answered, not in a way that the folks who file them want them to be, but often they are just simply ignored. And so that would be something else that the Biden administration could actually do for these communities.
Okay, well, thank you all. I think we've run up against our extended time, and now we're moving to wrap up. And I think what we should do, we on the program should leave. And if you this site, and if you want to participate in the wrap up, you should go to the live stream and watch the wrap up that will be led by the organizers of the conference. So if that's not too technologically challenging, and thank you all. This was fascinating. I enjoyed this immensely. You all have such incredible resources and such passion for your work. And Shawn, we're especially grateful to you for hiring a Vermont Law School graduate. So that distinguishes you in our hearts even more.
Hey, it was my privilege. She's doing me the favor, not vice versa. So thank you for mentioning that again, though.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.